Hi folks, today we're going to talk about something pretty fundamental for this class, which is what is game design? So game design is a kind of art, and at the same time, game design is also a kind of system building. Now, to understand what that means for it to be both, let's start by diving into the question, what kind of art is game design? And we'll start by contrasting it with another kind of art, right? So what kind of art is fiction writing? What kind of thing do fiction writers do, right? Well, fiction writers, they do things like develop characters, sequence plots, craft words, write and revise what they're creating into a long linear text that's aimed at producing emotional and intellectual responses, right? Game designers are clearly doing something different from that, right? There's one path through a novel, and yet through most games there are uncountable paths, right? I mean, theoretically uncountable. Some games have been solved. Theoretically countable, right? Some games have been solved, but uncountable to us as ordinary people. Okay, so what do game designers do? And what even are the parts of a game? Well, we can start by thinking about the question of like, what are the things, right? The nouns, the objects in a particular game, right? So what are the nouns in poker? Well, they're cards. They're often chips, right? And those are pretty concrete things, right? You can say like, this is a chip and show it to someone. You can leave it outside the context of the game and someone will still recognize it as a chip. There are also things that are more abstract, right? Like, this is your hand. If you left a pile of cards, people wouldn't, outside of a game context, people wouldn't necessarily say, oh, that's your hand. And then there's things like it being your turn. It's hard to imagine what it would mean for your turn to exist outside of the game, right? So these are comparatively abstract things. One interesting thing about the nouns is, at least for the concrete ones, you can often substitute them, right? So, like when I was in the Boy Scouts and we played poker, we didn't use chips because we didn't have chips, so we used matchsticks, right? You could play the game of poker like they're playing it with chips and so on a computer screen, right? So the cards and everything else would be represented only virtually, and everything would still work the same. Okay, so if those are the nouns, what are the verbs? What are the actions? What are the things you can do in poker, right? Now, these are things that tend to be written down in the rules, right? The rules might tell you use a pack of cards, but the main focus of the rules is like the things that you do as a player. So, for example, you might bet. That's one thing you could do as a player. You could raise as a player, right? What these things do, right, these verbs, is they move the game from one state to another state, right? When you fold, the number of players who's currently in the game decreases, right? When you raise, you increase the amount that people have to put into the pot to stay in the game, right? Okay, so those are the nouns and verbs. But this is still capturing only a little of what makes poker poker, right? So what actually happens when we play? I'm going to show a brief video of some people playing poker, and we can think about it and talk about it while it plays.
Flop has a deuce on it, a set for Don.
Okay, So in this version of poker, right, everybody has secret cards, and then there are shared joint cards. So Don Cheadle here has a very good hand because he's holding two secret twos, and there's a two out in the public shared stuff. All right, so he needs to move the betting up. That's what he's trying to do now. He's pretty sure he can beat everyone. He's trying to get the betting up. So let's watch what he does.
That's a race.
187. Murder was the case that they gave him.
Aggressive.
Murder.
Lucky for him, Antonio's so strong.
He's not calling.
Okay, so what he's trying to do is he's trying to convince this other player, right, Antonio the Magician Esfandiari, he's trying to convince him that he's not, that he's bluffing, even though he's not, right? And so there he succeeds, right, raising up to 187,000, making the play on murder, right? He's convinced the other guy he was bluffing, even though he has a very strong hand.
What's sick is how he's good enough to get away from this.
And then he went all in, right, trying to get him to go for it again. And here, Antonio is just like, what do I do next, right? Natalie Hoff Ramos was just like, I'm out as soon as she saw this kind of play happening, which was actually the smart move, right? Another thing to notice is how little of the time that the play is happening is actually consumed by things that are in the rules, right? It's other stuff that's taking the time and determining the outcomes in a lot of ways, right? So what is this thing that we're watching, right? This is gameplay, right? Well, it's gameplay and other things, right? So like, nouns and verbs are happening, what Zubek calls mechanics and systems, right? And then there's gameplay, right? So it involves things like calculating the odds, both in this hand and over the long term, trying to read people's faces and other mannerisms, performing, trying to get people to misread what is happening, right, for you, right? That might be part of why Don Cheadle did so well there. He's a professional performer, right? And then, of course, there's the things like taking actions using objects. And again, this stuff mostly isn't written down in the rules. And then what happens beyond that, right? You could write a computer program that would do some parts of gameplay, right? It could have a little computer vision camera process that would try to read people's faces and have a database of what people look like when they're bluffing and so on. But there's another thing that, as far as we know, no computer can do, which is have the experience, right? So that's Zubek's third category is player experience. So these are the things that arise out of gameplay, right? Excitement, fear, elation, regret, camaraderie, insights into the structure of the game, eating snacks, talking to each other, hanging out, right? These are things that are why people play games like poker, right? So if you look at Esfandiari's face here, right? He's got these downcast eyes, and at the same time he's got this like small smile. He's feeling a lot. And again, this is the main reason people play, and you can't write it down in the rules. It's at a different level. And in general, I would say this is what the arts do, right? They provide people opportunities to think and feel. Sometimes about abstract things, right? Like, this player is thinking a lot about probability right now, right? And how the structure of the randomness that's built into an individual poker hand, how that will affect him given different possible outcomes and what he wants to do, right? Often the arts are a prompt for us to think about things that are more specific. And sometimes they're both. Often, maybe they're both, right? If you think about a great novel, Mrs. Dalloway, you think specifically about the characters and their lives, but you also think more abstractly about the kinds of ways of being in the world, maybe the ways of living that that those individual stories bring to light. Okay, now obviously poker is a very different game for different people individually, for different groups at different times, right? But the game offers opportunities for certain kinds of things to happen, right? Other things that there aren't opportunities for won't happen. And what actually happens in the game and around the game is up to the players, right? But this is one way of looking at game design, is essentially the designer, right, which is the person with the cards there, the designer, they craft the mechanics and systems, right? The mechanics and systems give rise to certain somewhat predictable patterns in gameplay, right? Like poker's gonna be about risk and reward and probability and things like that. And then that gameplay gives rise to player experience, right? You're going to feel things like, risk and reward and so on. Now, that's another way of saying the work of a game designer is to manipulate nouns and verbs to try to shape player feelings and thoughts, right? That's game design. That's often what people say, that I've talked to who work professionally in game design, right? This is sort of how they express it, right? Like I build these things that give rise to higher order experiences. But it's also important to point out that this is game design, right? You might have goals as a designer for player feelings and thoughts. And you think, oh, okay, well, what kind of gameplay might provoke those kinds of feelings and thoughts? And then that might suggest, okay, what kinds of nouns and verbs, what kinds of mechanics and systems would I create in order to make the chain run back the other direction, right? In either case, right, the only thing that you can directly manipulate as a game designer is the nouns and verbs. But you think about the causality maybe in both directions, or you think about your goals in both directions, right? And to me, that's the answer of what kind of art game design is. It's the art of system building. You create these systems in order to provide possibilities for certain kinds of experiences for people that are of the sort that the arts care about, right? Okay. That said, there's certainly more to game development than just game design, right? In particular, right, Zubek draws our attention to the fact that there are things that designers have direct input on often, right? Like story, setting characters, visual design, user interface, and so on. And then things that they may have less direct input on, like tech quality and platform support. And all these things are super important to the final player experience, right? The game design, the mechanics and systems part of the game design is not the only thing that contributes to player experience. And for different games, the system may be more or less emphasized, right? In some games, it deliberately is simple and takes a back seat in order to emphasize other things, right? Okay. In this class, right, you'll have opportunities to engage all of game development, but our focus is on game design, and this is what game design means in the context of this class. Thanks.